Hey there, and welcome back to Crypto Clarified. This is the podcast series where we come together from time to time to discuss the most captivating headlines and trends in the crypto space. My name is Benjamin Dean, and I'm director in WisdomTree's digital assets team. Today, I'm joined by Dan Tapiero, who's the founder, CEO, CIO, managing director at One Roundtable Partners and 10T Holdings. It's going to be a great show. Before we dive in, though, social media shout outs. US listeners, check out wisdomtreeprime.com. You can also go on the Apple or the Android app stores. Check it out. It's live. You won't be disappointed. Hit subscribe if you're in podcast land on whatever platforms. Share with your friends. Sharing is caring, as you all know. And as always, you can find me at Benjamin Dean on the Bird app. So for today's episode, we're going to be chatting with Dan about a whole bunch of different topics. As always, we start with an introduction. Dan's got a super interesting background. His interesting work. So we can hear a bit about that. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, the history of money and technology, how they're intertwined. We're going to talk about a little bit about digitization of value, kind of current manifestation that we're seeing of this intertwining of the two elements. We're going to talk a little bit about how it's a global phenomenon, precisely because it is digital. And now people with internet connections, it's kind of worldwide. It's fascinating. Finally, we're going to wrap the final corner. We're going to talk about the digital asset ecosystem and how some traditional firms are now starting to enter the space. Then finally, as always, I'm going to do a bit of thinking about the future, because as you know, there's anything we love more than clarifying crypto. It's thinking about the future. Before we begin, shout out to James and Sam in compliance. Before we begin, I need to say the following. To clarify, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of WisdomTree and Dan Tapiero and his various organizations, and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not relied upon as forecast research or as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. Reliance upon them is the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. And now on to the fun stuff. Dan, welcome to Crypto Clarified.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. To kick off these episodes, usually when we have guests on, we'd like to hear a little bit about their background, how they got into the space, and what they find so interesting. I know you've got an interesting background, so I leave it to you just to inform the listeners a bit about you and the interesting work you do.
Yeah, thanks. I was 20 plus years in the macro hedge fund business. I started my career in the early 90s at Tiger Management, working for Julian Robertson in what was called then the macro group, so focused on bonds, currencies, emerging markets, commodities. After a time, I ended up working for Michael Steinhardt, who was another hedge fund manager. I was head of macro research there, and then worked with a group there that took positions actually at the time in Japanese currency and bond markets. Eventually made my way to working for Steve Cohen at SAC Capital, and I was there for 10 years. I ran macro there, I ran my own portfolio there, worked closely with Steve, actually sat next to him for about, I guess in all told, about 5 years, and focused again, purely macro. Left Steve to go work for Stan Druckenmiller. Stan, of course, had been at Soros for many years, and he was running his own firm, Duquesne, at the time. Again, ran my own macro portfolio there, worked with Stan. And then after a time, I came back, worked with Steve again, and then retired from that business in 2012. I had a little bit of a different experience than a traditional, I would say, hedge fund manager, because I also started two businesses from scratch when I was, and they were businesses that were based on a macro idea that I had. So I was very focused in 2006 on agriculture. I was working for Druckenmiller. We had very large positions in corn, soy, and wheat futures. I had a research team of about 4 people, and we'd written up this 50-page investment memo about the coming bull market in agriculture. And Stan just loved the idea and basically said to me, how else can we get exposure to this idea? So I came up with the concept of buying farmland in certain pockets in the US, buying certain crops in certain states. And we formed a company called AgCoa in 2006 in partnership with the Goldman Sachs partners. By 2013, it had become the largest private farmland REIT in the United States. We ended up selling it to CPP, the Canadian Pension Fund System, for $450 million. So that was an idea I had from scratch. It was a macro idea, and Stan really showed me how you can turn that into a business. Part of the advantage of that is that, of course, you don't pay all the trading capital gains when you're in the futures and swaps of the underlying instrument, you have to, and you're trading it, you pay short-term and long-term capital gains. When you own a business, you don't pay any capital gains until the very end. So they accrue for 7 years until the sale happens. So anyway, funnily enough, about 2 years ago, Bill Gates actually bought the farmland REIT that I'd started from CPP for about $1 billion. And so I don't know if you saw in the news, but at the time, Bill became the largest landowner in America. As a result, there were all sorts of conspiracy theories going around. He was cornering the food supply. He was just buying our portfolio and adding to his existing position. I did something very similar in 2009. I started another company that was a physical gold sales and storage business called GBI. And with an ex-partner from Goldman, who became the CEO. And actually today, he's still the CEO of the business, my co-founder partner. That business today is the third largest vaulter of gold in the world outside of the banking system. And so I mention that because it was through that business that I learned about Bitcoin in 2014. And it was Bitcoin and Ripple because GBI, Gold Bullion International, integrated with a firm at the time called BitReserve. And BitReserve today is the Uphold wallet. And so we were the first place in the world that you could actually go in and buy or sell gold to buy or sell Bitcoin or Ripple. And it took us a year to integrate with them. But that was my introduction to it. And frankly, I didn't really understand it. It was a bit of a strange experience because the business was making money from these transactions people were doing. And it made sense to me in a way, but I couldn't really understand how it worked. And I just kept trying, and I would try to read that white paper, Satoshi white paper, the 8 pages, and it was just very confusing to me. I didn't know anything about cryptography, about math or science. I mean, I was a macro portfolio manager. So I was looking at markets. I didn't really understand sort of the engineering aspect of Bitcoin, the fact that how the blockchains work together, how does the whole system work? So I gave up actually many times over a 5-year period before really focusing. It was at the end of 2018. So this is almost 4 or 5 years after the fact. And at the end of 2018, as you remember, the market had collapsed from the peak in 17 and went down around 85%, Bitcoin and Ethereum too. And I just thought to myself, okay, I've seen a bunch of markets like this before. You have big bubbles and then blow-offs. And when an asset drops 85, 90%, it's either going to zero or it's the big buying opportunity. So I actually, for my own entity, DTAP Capital, which I launched in 2003, started buying Bitcoin and Ethereum at early 2019. And I was buying, and at the same time doing a lot of research. I basically, hid away in my office at home, 6 months reading, listening to podcasts just like this, trying to figure it out, like first principles, really, how does it work? Why is it important? I really, as I said, I wasn't a cryptographer, so I didn't really understand much of that. But I did understand one thing, and this is important, why I've given you all this history, because it leads into sort of my light bulb moment, which is I finally understood that the white paper ends up solving a math problem that had been unsolved for hundreds of years called the Byzantine generals problem. And of course, I had never heard of this. What is it? It's the problem of distributed trust. How do two people trust each other? How do they send value to each other without an intermediary? Now, I had no idea that this was a thing, that, PhD math students had been sitting around for who knows how long, trying to come up with an answer to this problem. Anyway, Satoshi, through the proof of work algorithm and explaining how the Bitcoin network actually functions, and I called the Bitcoin network capital B, and then there's Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency, little b, which is the incentive mechanism to have the miners and the node operators validate the transactions on this decentralized network. And so how that whole thing works is more like an engineering paper. And once I understood that it had solved this impossible math problem. And there was 40 years, by the way, of cryptographic and scientific research papers that had come before it. I thought, oh my goodness, this is huge. This is much bigger than anything I'd ever thought. Might be the biggest macro investment trade of all time. It's the digitization of all value. And that light bulb moment went off because I thought, wow, this actually could be something as important as the invention of the combustion engine. It could be something as big as the discovery of electricity. This is not just a side thing. In fact, all things that require verification, all things that need a definitive truth can be stamped on a blockchain. And I thought, that even has the ability to change the way humans interact with each other. Because, there's a lot of ambiguity. Humans often tend to exaggerate, or I don't want to say lie, but, this comes, it's part of the human process. It's always, I remember Kant saying the crooked timber of humanity. And so to have a platform, a distributed network that was not controlled by anybody, where you could send value to each other, where I think eventually all things of value will sit on this blockchain in this broad digital asset ecosystem. I just thought, wow, how did I miss this in 2014? And what a dope I was. And then I started looking into making investments into the space. But I mean, that's sort of how I got into it. And then I founded 10T and then One Roundtable. And we've made 20, and I can get into that a bit later, but that's sort of my initial foray into it. It was realizing I'd come a little bit from an academic background. And once I saw all those, they footnote, I think it's 8 or 11 footnotes in the Satoshi white paper. I think it's 11. And once I saw that it was really a result of academic work, for some reason, I just attributed, greater value to it. And it also gave me an excuse to say, well, don't feel so bad that you were a dope in 2014, because this is very, very complicated stuff, is how I would say it.
Yeah, it's totally not obvious.
Long-winded, sorry, but
no, it's quite all right. I mean, that's a long story to the point where you get to now, and also helps kind of explain to a lot of folks who have missed it, but also there are roots to that technology. You go back to like Chaumian and eCash, you go back to
absolutely.
cypherpunks, Hal Finney, public key cryptography, and Zimmerman, and the decades before. When you see that lineage and you see how it evolved out of these interactions, a lot of which were academic, yeah, that does lend credence to it. Oh, this is the result. But I was wondering, you mentioned there.
One thing. Let me just say something. I've done many podcasts and interviews. I've spoken to many, many investors over the last 4 years. And I'll tell you, very few people understand that. And I would say 95% of the potential LPs that we have in our fund, when I first speak to them the first time, do not know that fact. And it's incredibly important. And I think the moat around the space, why hasn't adoption happened faster? Why for instance, are people of knowledge, especially in the US, that pushed back on this so dramatically? It's honestly mostly because they haven't really done that deep dive. They haven't really done the work. And it's not really their fault. Look, I tried for 5 years. I had a business that was making money from it. I was a portfolio manager. My whole life was focused on something different. How was I supposed to know about, some of these, academic works and Adam Back's discoveries? I mean, I'm supposed to know, right? Yeah. So I don't think we give people, we shouldn't give them too hard a time that they've missed it or whatever, or that they were late to it, because it is difficult.
Yeah, most people weren't hanging around the cypherpunks mailing list and weren't out fighting for PGP encryption to be available to all. They weren't working with hash 100%. Functions. But you have a background in history. And as the listeners know, there's nothing I love more than talking about technology history. Did that at all kick in at some point? Because you said industrial revolution, combustion engines, electricity, so you know about step changes in history. Did
Yeah,
that at all inform you, or at least help you like get
yeah.
up to speed?
So it did. And maybe I had a little bit of an unfair advantage in a sense because I had been trading gold as one of the many assets that I traded since the mid 90s. I, in fact, as I mentioned before, started a physical gold business. I really feel like I understand gold in a deep way as a store of value. But look, it's the one asset, and maybe now aside from Bitcoin, but gold is the one asset, the one thing that has value that I think the greatest number of people in the world know about. If you go into the desert of Africa, people know what the sun is, they know water, they know food, they know shelter, and they know gold. And so it was fascinating to me that gold had survived 5,000 years. It's fascinating when you look at monetary history of the United States, the UK, going on the gold standards, coming off the gold standard. The fascinating to me that you were legally not allowed to own physical gold from 1930. I think it's 1933 or 32 when Roosevelt banned holding, even though many people ignored that. But all the way up until I guess it was 72. Was it 72 or 70? I think it was 72 and Nixon took us off the gold standard.
Yeah.
And so, and the resulting impact that had on the value of money, the value of fiat currencies. I mean, gold went from $35 to 800 in the period of 8 years. I mean, it's just phenomenal. Understand also what that meant for the dollar. That meant the dollar went down, 99% against gold. If you had had gold instead of dollars or Swiss francs or Deutsche Marks, you had made a fortune. If you'd held on to the fiat, you'd gotten annihilated. And I think that history, I really understood. I understood that fiat currency and debt creation, and this started, of course, in the 1960s with LBJ and the Vietnam War, and Nixon taking us off the gold standard essentially so that he could do whatever he wanted, print as much money as he needed to pay for the war. But those deficits were man-made, and that the more dollars that were created, the less value they were against things that had limited supply. And so gold is something where the supply increases 1% a year. It's pretty stable. And again, I just, I saw many like also emerging market currencies go down in the 90s. I was very involved in the ERM situation in the early 90s, the Asian crisis in 97. So I was, steeped in deep, I would say, currency trading, currency knowledge, investment. And gold to me was one of those things that could not be debased. And so to me, that was phenomenal. And I know in the late 90s and early 2000s, gold was very low. It was down at $350. It had this big blow off into 1980. So that was understandable. But then I saw that after the peak in NASDAQ in 2000 and Greenspan's massive cutting of interest rates, that it was a way to really reflate the housing stock as an offset to the NASDAQ collapse, because many people were killed in the NASDAQ drop in 2000, and then September 11th happens, and then you have a recession. So from year 2002, interest rates went from 6.5% on the 2-year to essentially certainly zero in real terms. And I thought, oh my goodness, my savings are getting debased. This is in 02. What can I own that has a finite supply? And so as a market guy, and especially focused on macro and not a specific like equity long short hedge fund manager, that was something that was inbred in me. And so after 07, 08, I thought, oh my goodness, they took rates down to zero again. And rates in Japan were negative, rates in Germany were negative. And I thought, wow, every European and Japanese person should own gold, right? Because their savings are losing 3 to 5% on a real basis every single year. And that would be the beginning of a great bull market in gold. And again, I think gold bottomed at around $650 in '08. And again, my physical gold company I launched just at that time because I thought that people would want to own their physical bars and then not have them stored at a bank. Because if you're worried about a banking crisis, why would you hold your gold at a bank that you thought might go under? That to me made no sense. So I thought we're going to lease space from Brinks and at the time BMAT. We're going to have these vaults outside. We have 7 different vaults outside of outside of the banking system. And for people like me who wanted to know that their gold was in a vault with their name on it, and if they wanted it, they could go pick it up. They could have it stored in Singapore. They could have it stored anywhere around the world. And so I was deep into this concept of store of value, and I understood debasement of fiat. The funniest thing is that it wasn't really until after, I would say, the mid 2010s, but really after the publishing of the Satoshi white paper and the Bitcoin crew, that I started to hear about worry about debasement of fiat currency. That term was essentially in the 90s and 2000s a term for like that only global macro wonky fund managers ever talked about, right? Or economists, at the extreme. And so you never really, you never heard that. And then all of a sudden, when Bitcoin gets released, there's a finite supply of Bitcoin. The monetary policy is ruled by mathematics. It is this decentralized network. It is a permanent record of truth. And I just thought to myself, at the time, wow, that's cool, but I don't really get it. This is in 2012, 13, 14. I don't really get how it works, and it just appeared, and how does that make sense? It didn't make sense to me. But the concept of it cannot be debased, it can be a store of value, that was an easy bridge for me to get from being a gold-focused investor or a also commodity investor, really understanding real assets. And so for me, Bitcoin is in the history of money, the next stage in the evolution. We had gold, we had fiat, all of the central banks massively took advantage of having fiat power. I mean, the US has it, but so does Europe, and so does China, and so does everybody. And all of a sudden, we had, in 1985, we had this amount of fiat currency, and today we have an infinite amount of fiat currency. So clearly, that paper is worth less against a lot of real assets. And in some cases, including like NASDAQ. I mean, NASDAQ in some way can be thought of as a type of, real asset. I mean, I like Bitcoin better. And again, from the founding of Bitcoin, people don't know this, the NASDAQ from 2010 is down 99.99% against Bitcoin.
Yep.
So, companies can always issue more stock, right? Stock isn't limited necessarily in the way that Bitcoin is. Anyway, so I see it as part of the natural evolution. This digitization of value and money is just the next step. You have the internet for ideas and information, but now you've got the Bitcoin network and the code underneath it supporting the internet of value, which is, what I think this is.
There's another couple of elements there about Bitcoin. And if you bear with me, because you mentioned, who learns this stuff? If you've lived through things, you've seen real life. It marks you, right? And the listeners know I've lived everywhere. So I'm not going to do one of my Ben's stories again. What I will say is, though, I was reading a book recently called On the Trail of Odysseus. And it's about this guy who lives in modern day Bulgaria, but it's set between like 1850 and 1950, we'll say. And it's a time of great political upheaval in that region, particularly when the Russian Revolution happens. And so you have these people who can't trust the local currency, the lei. They get these Catherines, they're called, which are issued by the Russian state. But most of them would try and get gold. And when they get displaced, they have to fill their pockets, line their jackets with gold, get across the border and not have it taken off them, confiscated. In a digital world with Bitcoin, the only way you can confiscate is by taking the private keys. right? So it can move across, it doesn't move across borders necessarily. You can access it across borders with an internet connection. And the second piece you mentioned there around gold and custody, well, with the Bitcoins, you can self-custody it. You don't have counterparty risk anymore, which has become wildly apparent again this year with bank failures in the US. So those two elements on top of everything you've just said, also the way in which you can move in inverted commas and the way in which you can self-custody it and not take on counterparty risk means like, oh, wow, this is like, it's at least two steps forward, right? It's,
Yeah, I always liken it to a, it's like four-dimensional, it's like a flying car kind of thing. Like it's like a levitating kind of, yeah, flying car to me. It's just incredible how, and this is explained in the white paper, how we turn electricity from the analog world, from our world, into security in the digital asset ecosystem, in the digital world. And so bridging the real world to the digital world with the proof of work algorithm and the computations and the way that the entire system works is like, I mean, why isn't that the eighth wonder of the world? I mean, ninth, I don't understand. Like, it's unbelievable. And I do think that at some point, someday, this will win, I don't know, Nobel Prizes from the traditional world, but I think it'll be recognized as being, the figuring this out as one of the great inventions of the last sort of 50 to 75 years.
yeah, harnessing the power of mathematics and to some extent physics. It's like completely remarkable in a way if you stand back. But let's think a little bit about, you've already mentioned some of the conditions in which this emerges and has use, which is in a world with debasement of currencies. But if you used to be a portfolio manager and then kind of look across borders,
Mhm.
well, you would have had to trade across borders, right? Uh,
Sure.
how does this like globalization coupled with digitization mean almost the time comes for this kind of an innovation to arrive? Why is that useful in a world that's globalized and where transactions have to happen across borders
Yeah,
and how
but
people
it's
do it?
speed. Yeah, it's about speed. And also the existing system is very slow. I mean, look, the Swift system, okay, that we use for wires as an example, is a pre-internet invention. I mean, I think it was invented in the 50s or 60s. I can still take a week to send a wire to France from the US or whatever it is. And so the system we had was sort of a little bit digital in a way, but it requires so many different steps, so many different checkpoints, that it's massively inefficient. And look, in a world where there are only a handful of transactions every day, or whatever it is, it's 1950 or 1960. There, in a world today where fiat currency is really omnipresent. I mean, there's so much more that gets transferred back and forth as well. Also, you have the development of countries that didn't really exist. I mean, China and Russia in the 80s didn't really exist as economic entities. China in the 90s, I think the Chinese economy was smaller than the Canadian economy. So not really relevant. And now the world has grown up massively. And, as Larry Fink said 2 or 3 days ago, for the first time, Bitcoin is a global asset. Again, 2 years ago, he said it was a fraud.
Yeah,
Hopefully he just, since now he's got it. But I think that's very important. Also, 85% of total world cryptocurrency volume is done outside the US.
sure
And
is.
that's very important to understand. This is not a US only development. And it is probably the first time, certainly in a very long time, that the US has not been leading in financial technological innovation. I think that's hard for people, certainly in America, to get their heads around. The obvious use cases in places like Venezuela, Argentina, it's so clear to those people. And whereas in America, you have so many people still fuddy-duddying around, our 80-year-old leaders trying to figure it out. What is it? It doesn't mean anything. Is it fraud? It's just, it's the weirdest thing. They just haven't done the work to understand what we've discussed in the first sort of 20 minutes. And when they do, they're going to come around. And so I think, the US right now is lagging. I think we have until the election, maybe, where we don't really make any progress from the regulatory side. But many other jurisdictions are making huge progress right now. Hong Kong, London, UAE, Singapore, Switzerland have all been very welcoming. Um, maybe they just did more work. Maybe currency is something they understand better. Americans tend not to think about the value of the dollar. They're focused, if you watch CNBC, most of CNBC is just about the NASDAQ because Americans are just interested really in tech stocks, which is a sort of store of value in a way, but it because of that, it doesn't really allow them to think about currency. Whereas foreigners, and especially some of my investors in the funds, many foreigners, they really understand, oh my goodness, my currency went down 30% this year. I've lost purchasing power. How do we not lose purchasing power? How do we hedge against that outcome? And that's why you have people in places like Australia who, they understand currency, Aussie dollar against New Zealand, Aussie against the US. They have a gold understanding. A lot of gold is produced there. And so they're actually very much on the cutting edge. And I don't want to say the country is a first adopter, but I found very good reception there because they understand the basic tenets of currency. And I think that's why we've been slower here, um, you know, in terms of the rate of general adoption.
I find it
Yeah.
interesting as well. If you go to different places, everyone's trying to ask me, what is Bitcoin? What's it used for? And I say, look, it's used for lots of different things depending on where you are in the world and this technology
Yeah.
more broadly. I say, if you go to Argentina and there's 3 exchange rates and you can't move money in and out, well, you can use it as a store of value. But if you live in Vietnam and you rely on remittances, then you're going to use it for transactions across borders. And if
Of
it
course.
stays as a store of value, that's nice. But you change into Vietnam dong and then you just start transacting with it. They're just two examples, right? But the fact that it can be used by so many different people depending on the problems that they face, and people are quite resourceful and innovative, well, you say innovative, creative, when faced with problems, and then there's a potential solution. It might not be perfect, but the way in which it's used in so many different places is endlessly fascinating, especially because being open source software, it can be accessed by anyone with a cell phone and internet connection, right?
Right. Right. But that's the thing that's confusing for people. Like, how can code be worth something?
Yeah.
Like, I'm older than you are, and anybody over 50 who, is not really digitally native, and maybe they don't know how to program, they don't even know what that means. And certainly if you're 60 or 70 years old, you're not, very, very few people are tech savvy and understand it. Like, code can have value. And also, then they say, well, what about all these other cryptocurrencies? Well, it's originally the Bitcoin code that has just been adjusted, right? And that's another thing they don't understand. So there are 16,000 cryptocurrencies, 99.5% of them will go to zero. They all are being tweaked for different use cases. Again, for me, Bitcoin and Ethereum are the two core assets to the space. I think everything else is really just a venture project. Not stable coins. I think stable coins are real. We could move into this whole thing when you talk about use cases and different places in the world. If you go to Korea, Korea is the blockchain gaming capital of the world. If you go to France and you go to the NFT, you go to Paris Blockchain Week, you have many luxury goods companies talking about how they're incorporating blockchain technology into their business models, how they're getting closer to their, closer to their customer via the issuance of NFTs, and that the provenance of high quality luxury goods are being stamped on specific blockchains. So if you want to move into that realm and start broadly talking about what's going on in the entire digital asset ecosystem, it really blows the mind. And I would say most people don't understand or are not aware of how big it is. The space is $1.7 trillion in value. And that's the value of all the cryptocurrencies added up and the value of all the equity of the businesses in the space. All right. When I launched my fund in the middle of 2019, that's when I had the first idea for it. The space was 300 billion.
Yep.
So it's grown 5.5 times in 4 years. 18 months ago, it was 3.2 trillion. And so it's come off by half. Okay. It's a bear phase. I think that's over. And now we're moving up. But it's 1.7 trillion. It's not going to zero. It's not a fraud. It's not for bad guys who want to of course there's going to be some bad actors. There are bad actors who use cash,
Yeah.
right? Who, but it's when you have the epiphany that it's a true innovation and it's something completely new, you really have to pull yourself out of thinking about the structure of the old world and how money and monetary and fiscal policy works in the old world. And I think that's really tough. It is a tough one, but there are many, many use cases, not just the transacting and the store of value.
Well, yeah, let's go into that because, as you said, the space has grown and it's diversified, especially in the last 5 years. Um, what well, you mentioned before that actually, so I'll wind up a bit. Information has value. Now, I would have thought the whole subfield of information economics, the whole intellectual property thing, would just be screaming out that information can have value. We just watched a whole lot of companies built over the last 15 years, now called big tech, which a lot of them made money off, harvested data, which sold to advertisers. At least the insights were. So we know information has value. But there's one key element missing, which I think helps us understand why this space grew up and expanded. And it comes back to what you said at the top of the show when you quoted Kant. And it's about the kind of the trustlessness of the system. So if you can write entries on a distributed ledger that people cannot change, and you can prove that you're the one who wrote it because you used the public-private key pair to do it, then that is a totally different way in which to ensure entities can trust one another as compared to all the checks and balances in the manual systems. Now, you said stable coins before. The popular word this year is tokenization of assets. Do you have any thoughts there about what's happening? Because we're seeing all kinds of initiatives launched at the moment, especially from traditional financial service providers. I mean, what have they spotted there from this new technology that makes them think that they can do things they used to do in a more automated way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of things. It's instant settlement is certainly number one. It's also, getting rid of all of the different middlemen. I mean, my understanding is when you do a commercial property transaction in New York City, you have to go through 17 different steps. And so if you can reduce that to one step, but then you start talking about like smart contracts and programmable money, and then you really start to lose people because it's very confusing to understand that concept if you're not from this background. But the tokenization of real world assets is simply just putting all things that have value on a blockchain, and that blockchain residing somewhere in the digital asset ecosystem. Once it is on a blockchain, it can be fungible with other things. So you could have your house on a blockchain, a record of it, and you can, change that. You could swap that almost immediately for anything else that is of equivalent value on a blockchain. And that's pretty incredible if you think about it. It's all things could be fungible with each other in this space, but it's still very, very early. We invested in a company called Figure. Mike Cagney is the CEO there. He's phenomenal. I think he's doing groundbreaking work. There are other companies, Securitize, but they're very, very small, and it's just very early days. And I think it's the first batter of the first inning, to use the baseball analogy in this space. But I do think that now it is picking up momentum. And unlike 3 years ago, it was just sort of a concept. I think now you're starting to see, there are LP stakes and fund stakes that are being tokenized. I think, Figure is focused on tokenizing the mortgage-backed market, and I think that would be phenomenal first place to start. So you're starting to see it. I just think the space is so young, and there's really, if you think about it, so few people in it still, right? I mean, and I would say the average age is probably 27, and I would say 90% of the people in the space are under 35. So it's, you need to have a certain level of experience, et cetera. Tokenizing real assets, you need to have a relationship with those underlying assets. You have to have experience with them, and that can take 10, 20 years in some cases, for someone to really understand in depth how to transact in an opaque or illiquid market. So, or real asset market. But I think it's coming. I think there's huge opportunity there. But my fund only invests really in companies that have revenue of over about 40 to 50 million. We're the only growth stage fund, the growth equity fund in the world that's exclusively focused on crypto, Web3, blockchain businesses. And so we have a very good handle on the companies and the developments going on out there. And I can tell you, there's no company yet, aside from Figure, that has that type of revenue. They're mostly all still very early stage and venture type products with 5 million businesses, 5 million or 10 million in revenue. So again, that's why I'm saying it's so early. We're really on the ground. We've made 26 investments in the last 2.5 years, deployed $1.2 billion. I've got board representation on 12 of those 26 companies. So my team, my firm is really plugged in, and it is a theme that we really want to get exposure to. But it's just hard to right now. So that's why I give you some background, just to let you know we're watching it very carefully.
So you use the term there, put something on a blockchain, and use the term tokenization as well. And let's just clarify something for the listeners here, because a lot of changes in financial history are basically abstracting away from whatever kind of the base physical thing is. And those ledger entries can be put on different things. You could have it on paper. You could have it in a centralized database somewhere. I think it's something that's obvious to you as someone with your background, and especially with the gold experience. I mean, you put gold in a vault and then you issue shares against the gold holdings, and then suddenly you don't have to move the bars around. You can trade the shares and you go back and get the end.
Well, that's called unallocated gold, right? We don't do that. We sell anyway, but you're right. One can do that.
Okay. So yeah. The central idea, though, is that you're abstracting away from the physical thing. And so with the putting it on a blockchain, you're putting the entry on an indelible database that anyone can access and use and can read and write to. But you've still got to do all the stuff on the back end, right? And you have to do it correctly, because otherwise the entries on the ledger don't have much value, much like a land registry where the house can just be taken off somewhere, or the registry burnt doesn't really have much value either. So there's kind of a little thing going on there, and we're starting to see it with putting things on a blockchain that might make these things more liquid, more portable, more transparent, maybe. Depends how people do it. But
oh, for sure. I think for sure. I think many people just, when they try to figure this out, they just don't understand. So how do you actually put it on the blockchain, right? And then you're talking about like coding and all this kind of thing. And it goes over a lot of people's heads. And so they say, well, I just have to trust that that concept is something real. Like, well, I think if it works, it's real. You have hundreds now of traditional Web2 companies, traditional corporations. Just take Starbucks partnering with Polygon for their membership rewards program. You've got the California State Department of Motor Vehicles. They're putting everybody's licenses. They're going to give everybody in California a digital wallet so they can put their licenses and title deeds to their cars on the Tezos blockchain, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. I think there are many, many use cases too. I just think that that's something that people also have a little bit of a difficult time understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because people use public key encryption every day when they send their encrypted messages on WhatsApp, when they log on to their bank online. They use open source software all the time on Linux. So it's funny that people use it all the time now. They don't even question it because it works. It's proven to work. I suspect it's just a matter of time before the technology falls in the background, and it's just the way you do it. It reminds me of the Estonians. Once the Cold War ended, they had to set up like a national IT infrastructure from scratch on like a shoestring budget, and they use what you'd call an early version distributed ledgers in order to do it.
Yeah.
For them, it's just normal. It's just like how I pay my taxes, and it's how I show who I am. And they use public key cryptography to essentially sign the transactions. And I guess, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed, but we're watching it play out in real time, which is super interesting. Dan, we're coming up on time, and we usually end these shows, though, asking guests what they're thinking about in the future. And I'm sure you've got lots of things you got your eye on, given your work and your ventures. What if listeners wanted to put their eyes somewhere that's interesting? Where would you encourage them to point their eyes?
My goodness. I mean, there's so
It's a
many.
big question.
Yeah, there's so many things. What I would say is this. I would say that you have to begin with Bitcoin. So it's difficult to uh, look into the future, and um, I would say to focus on any one thing, and I can mention 10 different things. But if you don't understand the basic premise behind Bitcoin, it's going to be hard to understand all of these other things in the future. And I think the easiest way is just go out and buy a little Bitcoin and then put it on a ledger, put the ledger in your pocket and walk around and, feel that like you have, control, right? It's your currency. It's in your wallet, hardware wallet. It's, completely yours. It can't be taken away. Um, and then I think, you do Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then you start to play around a little bit in the ecosystem. And I think once you do that, and maybe you then, I don't know, maybe you decide you want to start staking your coins and you start learning about proof of work versus proof of stake. Then you start learning about Ethereum versus Bitcoin, how that's different. But I think stable coins are going to be a very important part of our future. 3 years ago, stable coins didn't really exist.
No.
And last year in 2022, despite the bear phase in the market, there was $8 trillion of stable coins that were settled. I mean, 8 trillion. So hello. And maybe in 3-4 years, it's 80 trillion. And I think learning about stable coins is a good segue into then maybe you'll start to think about tokenization of real world assets, right? Because you will be holding your fiat in digital fiat currency, right? Which are stable coins, and you'll be transferring digital fiat to purchase, whatever real world asset there is, right? And so I think that's a good place to start, right? Is start with a Bitcoin, transition to looking at the DeFi world a little bit, and then move into understanding how stable coins and um, tokenized real world assets could be a reality.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Got to start somewhere.
I think it's hard. I mean, like then there's NFTs are also another sort of offshoot that are fascinating and are not going away. People just think it's art projects. It's not. Non-fungible tokens are used for all sorts of different things. Um, anyway, we could go on and on about this, but I do think it is the most exciting area, certainly that I've ever been involved with. I think it's a reimagining of it'll lead to the reimagining of the entire financial system. And I think it has the ability, as I said very early on, to change the way human beings interact with each other. And so that to me is a big deal and worth spending your time figuring out what it is.
Yeah, there's not small ideas. And with the holiday season coming up, people might be about to travel places. So you often have $50 to $100 in a Bitcoin or a stable coin or something. And I walk around and eventually, maybe I go to weird places, probably. But eventually it turns up where someone accepts that as payment. And then you go and see when you go and send it to somebody and see it goes straight from phone to phone in inverted commas. And then you just go, oh, wow. And you just take your cell phone wherever you are. No need to hit any withdrawal fees or anything at an ATM. It goes peer to
Right.
peer and you hold the
Right.
keys, right?
It's fascinating. When you make that first transaction and you realize there's nobody in between you and the other person, it's just, if you've been going to a bank for 30 years or 20 years or whatever it is, it really, I think it does light a fire for people.
Yeah.
So that's the first place to start.
Yeah.
So.
And then you see it works. And then you don't have to go and learn about public key cryptography and the history of the cypherpunks because it just works. Cool. So Dan, where can people find you on the interwebs?
Well, I'm on Twitter, DTapCap. And then I'm also on LinkedIn quite a lot. And that's just under my name. And my fund is 1rtfund.com and also 10tfund.com. And, I'm pretty, since I've moved into the space in the middle of 19, I'd never done Twitter before. I'd actually never even spoken publicly really about investments or anything. But as you know, this space, it's more collegial. People kind of root for each other in many different areas. And it just, so it's normal to do podcasts, et cetera. And so even if you just like go on YouTube or Google me, there are plenty of podcast interviews that I've done. But I have to say, I really enjoyed this one. And, your level of understanding and knowledge about the history and the root and is really, I think, impressive. And also, people who watch your show, they should understand that not all interviewers and podcasters have your level of and depth of understanding. So it's fun.
Very kind words, Dan. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to chat today. I've also really enjoyed the discussion. Everyone knows I love talking about the history of technology, so this has been an absolute blast. Thank you once again. Unfortunately, we are out of time though, folks. I hope everyone's found today's podcast useful and informative. If you're in the US, wisdomtreeprime.com. You can go to the Apple and Android app stores, check it out. Find me at Benjamin Dean on the Bird app. And as always, if people like snail mail and want to let us know what they want to talk about, cryptoclarified@wisdomtree.com. Send us an email, or you can hit me up on the Bird app. I don't mind, whatever's most easy. Excellent. Well, that's it for today. Dan, thank you once again. I hope everybody has an excellent day.